The fluorescent lights hummed against polished marble floors, casting reflections that stretched the length of the empty lobby. Daniel pushed his mop forward, steady and rhythmic, as if each stroke kept time with the beating clock on the wall. Midnight shifts were his world now, when the building emptied of power suits and chatter, and he could exist without being noticed. The skyscraper belonged to Hawthorne Global, a financial empire where billions moved across oceans with a single phone call. To Daniel, it was just where he scrubbed away footprints and spilled coffee. Every night executives brushed past him without eye contact, their heads buried in glowing screens. He wasn't a man to them, just part of the background, as replaceable as the mop in his hands. He accepted it, not with bitterness, but with quiet resolve. Because every hour he spent here meant medicine for Lily's lungs, meant tuition that kept her in a decent school, meant one more day she could dream beyond their cramped apartment. At home, she left him notes folded on the fridge, stick-figure drawings of them holding hands beneath a crooked sun, scrawled in purple crayon, "I love you, Daddy." Those drawings were his compass, reminding him why he endured the silence of being unseen. But Daniel was not as simple as he seemed. Behind his tired eyes was a history no one here would believe, a past he kept buried deeper than the stains he scrubbed from these tiles. Tonight, though, something felt different. He noticed it the moment he walked into the building, the tension in the air. Executives didn't leave early. Lights on the top floor glowed long past midnight, and from the stairwell above came the sharp echoes of voices, urgent, clipped, rehearsed. Daniel paused, leaning on his mop. He caught fragments as the elevator doors opened. "Tokyo investors, next week deal must close." A man in a tailored suit stormed past, tossing his empty coffee cup into Daniel's trash bin without a glance. Daniel froze. Tokyo? He hadn't heard that name in years. The words clawed at memories he had tried to bury, flashes of train stations, cherry blossoms, conversations that once defined his life. He shook it off, lowering his head again. Stay invisible. That was his rule. But curiosity tugged at him. From across the polished hall, he heard the CEO's voice, Richard Hawthorne himself, a man Daniel had only seen in glossy magazine covers. "We cannot afford a mistake. This is the deal of the decade." Executives crowded around, frantic. "Sir, we're finalizing the itinerary. Translators, hospitality, everything locked." Daniel's hands tightened on the mop handle. Translators, investors, Japan. The words overlapped with the sound of Lily's cough echoing in his head, reminding him of why he worked here, why he couldn't risk exposure. Still, he lingered, ears sharpened to every detail. He shouldn't have been listening, but he couldn't stop. And in that moment, standing unseen in the shadow of power, Daniel realized something. The secret he'd buried might no longer stay hidden. The alarm clock blinked 16 a.m. in the dim apartment. Daniel sat at the small kitchen table, still in his janitor uniform, staring at the stack of envelopes. Rent, utilities, a pharmacy receipt with Lily's inhaler circled in red ink. Each one was a reminder that his paycheck never stretched far. Enough. From the bedroom, he heard a soft cough. Not sharp, not alarming, but enough to make him pause, listening. When Lily was born, the doctors called it mild asthma. Manageable, they said. But Daniel learned quickly that manageable meant expensive. Every month meant juggling bills, calculating which debt collector would wait the longest. He pushed the envelopes aside and looked at the refrigerator. It wasn't filled with groceries. It was covered in crayon drawings, stick figures holding balloons, a house with a crooked chimney, him and Lily standing under the words, "Daddy is my hero." He exhaled, steadying himself, and whispered, under his breath, "I won't let you down." But there was a time when life promised him more. Flashback. 10 years earlier. Daniel stood in a crowded university hall, wearing a suit too small for his frame, but his posture proud. He was a scholarship kid who beat the odds, a young man fluent in 3 languages, preparing for a career in diplomacy. Professors called him gifted, the kind of mind that could bridge nations. Then the phone call came. His father was gone. His mother alone, and his younger brother drowning in legal trouble. Daniel didn't hesitate. He gave up the internship in Washington, flew back home, and shouldered everything. Family first, always family. But the world doesn't give second chances easily. Opportunities slipped away. By the time he tried to return, doors had closed. His resume looked like a story of failure instead of sacrifice. Back in the present, he poured cereal into a chipped bowl as Lily shuffled in, rubbing her eyes. Her hair was messy, her voice groggy. "You're still awake?" she asked. "Couldn't sleep," he said with a smile. He slid the bowl toward her, watching her eat as if every spoonful proved he was doing something right. She finished, picked up a purple crayon, and added to one of her old drawings. 2 stick figures now standing in front of a tall building. She pointed at it. "That's where you work, right?" Daniel chuckled softly. "Yeah, that's the place." "And one day," she said, serious now, "you won't have to clean it. You'll be the boss." The words hit him harder than she knew. He crouched beside her, taking the drawing in his hands, his voice lowered, almost breaking. "One day, you'll have the life I couldn't. That's my promise." Her cough interrupted, short but sharp. Daniel jumped, already reaching for the inhaler. Relief came when she steadied, but his hands shook. As she ran off to get ready for school, Daniel folded the drawing carefully, sliding it into his pocket. He had no idea that in just days, that promise would be tested in ways he never imagined. The morning sun burned against the glass of Hawthorne Global's upper floors, but inside the boardroom, the air was ice. Richard Hawthorne stood at the head of the long oak table, suit pressed sharp enough to cut, eyes locked on the clock. "Where is the translator?" His voice snapped across the room like a whip. Executives exchanged nervous glances. A young assistant shuffled papers, stammering. "Sir, we confirmed her yesterday. She hasn't answered her phone this morning." Richard's jaw tightened. He hated surprises, especially today. The Japanese investors were flying in within hours, and this deal wasn't just big, it was the deal. Billions in technology rights, expansion into Asia, his legacy. Find her, now. The room scattered into chaos. Phones buzzed, interns ran for files, sweat dampened collars. Richard paced like a predator in a cage. Just outside the glass wall, invisible to all of them, Daniel pushed his mop down the hallway. He caught fragments through the crack of the door, words like investors, Tokyo, and catastrophe. He knew enough to sense the weight pressing on every executive's shoulders, but he kept his head down. That was his rule. Be invisible. Don't get involved. A manager stormed past, nearly knocking over Daniel's bucket. "Watch it," the man snapped without looking, his phone still glued to his ear. Daniel stepped back, silent, gripping the mop tighter. Inside the boardroom, voices rose. "Without a translator, we can't manage cultural nuance. They'll walk. We need backup, hire someone fast. No one qualified will be available on such short notice." Richard slammed his hand against the table. "Excuses don't close deals, solutions do." Daniel glanced up just for a second. Through the glass, he saw the CEO's face, calm on the surface, but his eyes betrayed something raw, fear. Executives scrambled to contact agencies. Phones rang unanswered. The closer the meeting loomed, the more desperate their tone became. "Sir, even if we find someone, they won't understand finance at this level." Richard's voice dropped, cold and measured. "Then we make them understand. But failure is not an option." Daniel turned away, pushing his mop slowly, heart steady but ears burning. Every word pulled at memories he didn't want to revisit. Fluent conversations, negotiation rooms, cultural missteps corrected with a single phrase. A life that used to be his. He shook the thought from his head. That man was gone. Now he was just a janitor with a daughter who needed him alive and employed. But as he passed the boardroom again, he caught Richard's final words before the door closed. "If this deal collapses, heads will roll. I'll make sure of it." The words lingered like smoke. Daniel pushed his bucket down the silent hallway, but for the first time he felt the pull of the storm gathering just beyond the glass. He didn't know it yet, but the chaos he tried to avoid was about to reach him, whether he wanted it or not. The boardroom gleamed under recessed lights, but the tension inside it was anything but polished. 12 executives sat rigid at the long table, papers spread like shields before them. At the head, Richard Hawthorne clasped his hands, forcing calm, but the vein at his temple betrayed the pressure simmering beneath. Across from them sat the Japanese investors, 3 men in tailored suits, their expressions unreadable. The translator, seated between the groups, was clearly out of her depth, drafted at the last second, an intern with a phrasebook and a nervous smile. Richard opened the meeting. "Gentlemen, we are honored to have you." The intern stumbled, her voice quivering. As she relayed the words, something was lost in translation because one of the investors frowned, whispering to the man beside him. Richard continued, presenting graphs and projections, but each exchange fell flatter than the last. The investors shifted in their seats, their brows furrowing deeper. "Tell them we value this partnership," Richard said. The intern nodded, flipping through notes. She strung together a sentence, but the Japanese words she chose painted a different picture. Instead of partnership, she said ownership. A single syllable wrong, but the meaning shifted from respect to dominance. The investors stiffened. One crossed his arms, unimpressed. Another checked his watch. Richard noticed their reaction. His face reddened. "What did you just say?" he hissed under his breath at the intern. I think I got it right," she stammered. "You didn't." Richard's voice was a low growl. At the back of the room, crouched over his mop bucket in the hallway, Daniel heard every word. He hadn't meant to linger, but the tension drew him closer, ears straining through the cracked door. When the intern repeated herself, Daniel winced. His lips moved before his mind could stop them. He muttered under his breath, almost a whisper, "No, it should be Kyoto, not Shoyu." Perfect Japanese, fluid, native level. The sound slipped into the boardroom like a ghost. Every head turned toward the doorway. The intern froze, her eyes wide. Richard's gaze snapped past the table, past the investors, straight to the man in coveralls holding a mop. For a moment, silence consumed the room. The only sound was the faint drip of water into Daniel's bucket. One investor leaned forward, intrigued. "Who said that?" he asked in Japanese. Daniel's heart stopped. He hadn't realized they'd heard him. He hadn't meant for anyone. His eyes darted to the floor, but it was too late. Richard stood slowly, his voice cutting through the silence. "You. Step forward." Daniel's grip tightened on the mop handle. His instinct screamed to run, to apologize, to vanish. But his feet wouldn't move. The investors whispered among themselves, their eyes locked on him with curiosity. Richard's expression hardened, suspicion etched into every line of his face. "The janitor," he said, almost to himself. The janitor just spoke Japanese. And with that, Daniel's carefully built invisibility shattered. Richard's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You, inside, now." Daniel froze at the doorway, mop still in his hand. His throat tightened. He wanted to disappear back into the hallway to pretend he hadn't spoken. But the investor's curious eyes pinned him in place, waiting. An executive hurried to the door, grabbing Daniel's arm. "Come on." He stumbled forward, every step heavier than the last. The boardroom smelled of cologne, paper, and tension. He set down the mop and bucket, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he faced the table. Richard's glare burned into him. "Repeat what you said." Daniel swallowed. He spoke slowly, carefully, in Japanese. "You meant to say partnership." She said ownership. "It changes the meaning completely." The lead investor's eyebrows lifted. He responded in Japanese, testing him with a phrase that wove business terms with cultural nuance. Without hesitation, Daniel answered, fluent, respectful, precise. The room shifted. The investors leaned in, engaged for the first time that morning. Their stiff posture softened. One even nodded in approval. An executive whispered under his breath, The janitor? Another hissed back. How the hell? But Daniel wasn't performing. He was surviving. His focus tunneled in on the investors, translating with precision, smoothing over each misunderstanding. He explained cultural references the executives would never have caught. When to pause, when to defer, when a phrase carried unspoken meaning. Bit by bit, the room thawed. The investors asked more questions, their tone no longer skeptical but intrigued. The numbers on the slides started to matter again. For the first time all morning, Richard allowed himself to breathe. The disaster had been pulled back from the jaw, but his relief was poisoned by suspicion. He didn't like mysteries, and Daniel was now the biggest one in the room. When the meeting wrapped, the investors bowed slightly, their smiles faint but genuine. Your man has shown great respect, the lead investor said in accented English, nodding toward Daniel. It matters. Richard forced a thin smile. Of course, we value all our team members. The investors filed out, leaving only the executives, Richard and Daniel. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Executives still whispered disbelief. Etched on their faces, where did he learn that? Why is he here? Richard didn't whisper. He fixed Daniel with a stare sharp enough to cut steel. Who exactly are you? Daniel shifted, his shoulders heavy. He could feel every eye in the room pressing against him, demanding an explanation. I used to study once, he muttered. That's all. It wasn't the truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Richard's jaw clenched. His instincts told him this wasn't some coincidence. This janitor wasn't ordinary. And Richard Hawthorne hated not knowing the whole story. Dismissed, Richard said coldly. Daniel turned, retrieving his mop, his heart pounding. He'd saved their deal, but in doing so he had exposed himself, and Richard wasn't going to let it go. The boardroom was empty now, chairs pushed back, the echo of hurried voices still clinging to the walls. Daniel moved to collect his mop, eager to slip away. But before he reached the door, Richard's voice stopped him. Stay. Daniel turned. Richard leaned against the head of the table, jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. You saved me from an international embarrassment today, Richard said. His tone wasn't gratitude. It was an accusation disguised as praise. That means you're not who you pretend to be. Daniel straightened, hands at his sides. I'm just the janitor, sir. Richard smirked. Janitors don't speak flawless. Japanese, and they don't correct billion-dollar deals like it's second nature. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. So here's what's going to happen. Starting tomorrow, you're no longer mopping floors. You'll be working as a temporary consultant. Daniel froze. The word consultant sounded like a gift, but he heard the steel underneath. Richard continued. Better pay, a chance to prove your loyalty, and in return you'll keep doing what you did today, translate, guide, make sure these investors trust us. And if I refuse? Daniel asked quietly. Richard's smirk vanished. Then I'll find out why a man with your skill set is hiding in my building, cleaning floors. And I'll make sure the answers don't look good for you. The silence, stretched, heavy and suffocating. Richard turned and walked out, leaving Daniel alone with his mop and a decision he didn't want. That night, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at a pile of bills spread like landmines across the wood. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator. Lily padded in, wearing her pajamas, hair tied in messy braids. She climbed onto the chair across from him, her small legs dangling. You're quiet, she said, watching him. Daniel forced a smile. Just tired. She tilted her head, unconvinced. Is it about work? He looked down at the stack of envelopes, rent overdue, electricity past due, and the latest from the pharmacy for her inhaler. Each one was a reminder of how thin the line was between survival and collapse. He folded his hands together, rubbing his thumb against his knuckles. It's complicated. Lily reached over, sliding one of her drawings across the table. This one showed them standing in front of their apartment, holding hands under a bright sun. She had written 3 words at the bottom in crooked letters. We are okay. Daniel's throat tightened, but deep down he knew they weren't okay. Not really. and refusing Richard's offer could push them past the point of no return. He closed his eyes, whispering to himself, "I can't afford to say no." When he opened them, Lily was gone, back to her room. The apartment felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were waiting for his choice. Finally, Daniel picked up one bill, then set it back down. His hand shook as he admitted the truth. He would accept Richard's offer. The next week at Hawthorne Global didn't feel the same. Daniel was no longer sweeping floors in silence. He was sitting in meetings, translating documents, guiding executives who now looked at him with equal parts curiosity and suspicion. Some whispered admiration when he walked by. "Guy's brilliant. Could have been one of us." Others smirked. "Or he's just a fraud who got lucky." Daniel ignored both. His focus stayed on the work, but every step into the glass offices felt like stepping into a spotlight he didn't want. He'd spent years erasing himself. Now, suddenly, people were looking. One evening, after another long day of shadowing Richard's team, Daniel stood at the copy machine. The hum of the machine blurred into memories. Tokyo streets lit by neon, the sound of trains pulling into Shinjuku Station, the voice of a woman he hadn't heard in years. "Daniel-san, you're late again." He saw her face in his mind. Yumi, his wife. At least she had been. Their small apartment in Tokyo had been filled with laughter once, and hope. But his long hours, his ambition, and then the scandal. Daniel's chest tightened. He could still hear the words that ended it. "You've shamed us both. Leave." It had all unraveled so fast. A single accusation at the embassy where he worked. Whispers of impropriety. Documents mishandled. He hadn't been guilty of what they said, but in Japan, reputation was everything. The scandal stuck. His marriage crumbled under the weight. And when the job disappeared, so did his future. That was when he ran. Back home, to the life of anonymity. To Lily. Back in the office, Daniel snapped out of the memory when two executives passed by, laughing. "Did you hear the janitor was married? Japan? Wonder what else he's hiding." "Yeah, guy like that doesn't just end up scrubbing toilets for no reason." Their voices faded down the hall, but Daniel felt the sting. Rumors had begun to spread, twisting his past into office. In another corner of the building, one executive wasn't laughing. A junior analyst named Carter sat hunched over his desk, digging. He had pulled Daniel's personnel file, thin, almost empty. But that wasn't enough. Carter searched immigration records, old news clippings, anything that hinted at why a man fluent in multiple languages had vanished into janitorial work. And then, buried in a digital archive, Carter found it. A headline in Japanese, with Daniel's name printed, alongside the words "scandal" and "dismissal." He smirked, printed the page, and slipped it into an envelope. That evening, as the office lights dimmed, Carter walked into Richard's private office. He set the envelope on the CEO's desk. Richard looked up from his glass of scotch, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What's this?" "Answers," Carter said. "About your janitor." Richard slid the papers out, scanning the foreign headlines. His lips curled into a thin smile, half satisfaction, half intrigue. "Well, well," he murmured. The game had just changed. The boardroom buzzed with tension. Charts glowed on the screen, executives shuffled papers, and the Japanese investors sat neatly, their expressions as unreadable as stone masks. Daniel stood near the corner, translator once again holding his composure. Every word he carried across the language barrier mattered. Richard, however, wasn't focused on the deal. He was focused on him. When the final slide faded, Richard rose, slowly from his chair. "Before we move forward," he said, his voice dripping with false calm, "there's something the board should know." Executives froze. Daniel's pulse quickened. Richard held up a folder, thick, official, stamped. "This man, our so-called savior, hasn't been honest with us. He isn't just a janitor. He's a deserter. He abandoned a diplomatic posting in Japan years ago. Walked out on an assignment, left chaos in his wake, and vanished." Gasps filled the room. Heads swiveled toward Daniel. A few whispered, "Is it true?" Others leaned back, faces souring as if he'd betrayed them personally. Daniel's throat tightened. He tried to speak, but his voice caught. The shame he'd buried was suddenly dragged into the open, ripped wide for all to see. Richard slammed the folder onto the table. "Tell me, Daniel, how long were you planning to lie? How long were you going to use this company to hide from your past?" Daniel looked at the polished table, his reflection staring back, warped and broken. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that what happened back then wasn't betrayal but sacrifice. But the words died in his chest. Executives muttered. One stood. "Mr. Hawthorne, if this is true, we can't keep him here. It's a liability." Richard smirked, victory flashing in his eyes. He was seconds away from ordering security to escort Daniel out. And then a quiet voice cut through the noise. The lead Japanese investor spoke, in Japanese, directed not at Richard, but at Daniel. "We remember you." The room fell silent again, the ray. Investor leaned forward, his tone respectful. "You were at the embassy in Tokyo. You argued for our people when others dismissed us. You honored our customs. You protected us during negotiations. You did not abandon us, you defended us." Another investor nodded. "Yes, we wondered what happened to you." Murmurs spread, this time in Daniel's favor. Executives who moments ago looked at him with suspicion, now stared in stunned silence. Daniel finally raised his head, meeting the investor's eyes. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a janitor, not as a deserter, but as the man he once was. Richard's jaw tightened. His plan had backfired. The investor's words carried more weight than his accusations, and everyone in the room knew it. The lead investor turned to Richard. "We trust him. His honor is not in question." The shift in the room was immediate. Executives sat straighter, whispering again, but the tone was different now, uncertainty aimed at Richard instead of Daniel. Richard forced a tight smile, but his eyes burned with anger. His control was slipping, and he knew it. Daniel stood quietly, but inside, one truth was clear. Richard wasn't done with him. Not yet. The apartment was dark except for the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through torn blinds. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, elbows on the wood, face buried in his hands. His chest heaved as the words replayed in his mind. Richard's accusations, the gasps in the boardroom, the humiliation that clung to his skin like a second layer. He had thought he could bury the past. He was wrong. The sound of small footsteps broke the silence. Lily appeared in the doorway, clutching her blanket. Her hair was tangled from sleep, and her eyes widened at the sight of her father hunched over. "Daddy?" she asked softly. Daniel looked up, quickly wiping his face. "Hey, sweetheart, what are you doing up?" "You're crying." He forced a smile, shaking his head. No, just tired." She walked closer, climbing into the chair beside him. Her little hand reached across the table and rested on his. "Is it about work?" Daniel hesitated. For so long he had shielded her from the weight he carried, keeping the world's cruelty away from her small shoulders. But tonight, the mask cracked. "Maybe," he whispered. "There's a chance I could lose this job." Her face fell. "But then how will we pay for my medicine? Or school?" The question stabbed at him. He couldn't lie. "I don't know." Silence lingered, heavy and suffocating. Then Lily slid off her chair, rummaged through the drawer where she kept her crayons, and returned with a folded sheet of paper. She laid it on the table with the solemnity of a gift. "Here," she said. Daniel unfolded it slowly. The drawing was simple, drawn in crooked lines and uneven colors. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, stood side by side under a bright yellow sun. Above them, in bold purple letters, she had written, "You are my hero." His throat closed. He stared at the page as tears blurred the lines. Lily leaned against him. "Even if you don't have that job, you're still my hero." He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. She smelled of crayons and sleep. In that moment, The shame and fear pressing on him shifted into something sharper. Resolve. For years, he had lived invisible, shrinking into shadows, convincing himself survival was enough. But Lily deserved more than survival. She deserved a father who stood tall, even when the world tried to push him down. He kissed the top of her head, whispering into her hair, "I promise, no matter what happens, I'll make things right." She nodded sleepily, satisfied, and padded back to her room. Daniel stayed at the table, staring at the drawing. The words glared back at him, "You are my hero." He folded it carefully, sliding it into his pocket. The decision was made. He couldn't hide anymore. Tomorrow he would confront Richard, and this time he wouldn't back down. The boardroom felt more like a courtroom that morning. Executives lined the table, their faces pale with tension. The Japanese investors sat quietly at the far end, their notebooks closed, their eyes sharp. And at the center stood Richard Hawthorne, tall, polished, and seething. Daniel sat across from him, calm on the outside but burning inside. Lily's drawing rested folded in his pocket. The words, "You are my hero," echoed in his mind like armor. Richard broke the silence first. "You've got two options, Daniel." His voice was steady but laced with venom. "You pledge your loyalty to me, keep translating, keep smoothing things over, or I'll tear apart whatever life you have left." The room stiffened. Executives exchanged glances. Daniel straightened in his chair. "I won't be your pawn." Richard's smile dropped. "Careful." Daniel rose, his voice louder now, carrying through the boardroom. "You talk about loyalty. Richard, but what about yours? To this company, to these people?" He pointed at the executives, then the investors. How many of them know about the shell companies, the accounts overseas, the millions siphoned into projects that don't exist? Gasps erupted. One executive dropped his pen. Richard slammed his fist on the table. "Lies!" Daniel didn't flinch. "Check the records. I've seen them. Hidden deals signed in back rooms. Money that should have gone into growth pocketed for your personal empire." Executives scrambled, whispering furiously, pulling out phones, typing into laptops. The Japanese investors remained silent, watching with interest. Richard's face turned crimson. "You think they'll believe you? You're a janitor." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Maybe, but I haven't lied to them, I haven't stolen from them, and that's why they will believe me." The lead investor finally spoke, his calm voice slicing through the noise. "Mr. Hawthorne, integrity is more valuable than profit. This man shows respect for our culture, for our words. We cannot say the same for you." The boardroom shifted again. Executives' loyalty cracked like thin ice. One cleared his throat. "If what Daniel says is true, we need an independent audit." Another added, "We can't risk this deal or the company on your word alone." Richard exploded, his voice booming. "You'd take his side? A janitor with a sob story?" But the room no longer belonged to him. The board chair, silent until now, leaned forward. "Mr. Hawthorne, the vote is clear. You're removed as CEO effective immediately." The words struck harder than any punch. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came. Security stepped in quietly, waiting for him to leave. Daniel exhaled, but his relief was cut short. From the hallway came a roar of noise, journalists, cameras, reporters flooding the lobby. The meeting hadn't stayed private. As Richard was escorted out, the cameras turned to Daniel. Flashes lit the air, microphones thrust forward. "Who are you, really? Why were you hiding? What's your next move?" Daniel froze at the doorway, the drawing still in his pocket. He had won this battle, but the world was demanding answers. And he couldn't stay silent anymore. The lobby of Hawthorne Global pulsed with chaos. Reporters swarmed like bees, cameras flashing, microphones thrust into the air. The sound of overlapping questions created a deafening hum. Daniel stood frozen, the center of it all, his back pressed against the marble wall as if he could melt into it and disappear. He wanted to run. That old instinct, stay invisible, keep quiet, gripped him hard. "Mr. Daniel, who are you really? Why were you cleaning floors when you could have been leading meetings?" Is it true you deserted your post in Japan? The questions cut like knives. Executives slipped past the crowd, eager to save themselves, and at the far end, Richard was being escorted out, his face twisted in rage, shouting about betrayal, as cameras recorded his fall from power. Daniel's heart pounded. He took one step toward the exit, ready to vanish before the spotlight swallowed him whole. But then his hand brushed against his pocket. The folded paper. Lily's drawing. "You are my hero." He stopped, his chest tightened. Walking away now would make a liar out of that promise. Slowly, Daniel turned back toward the crowd. The microphones shot forward again, the noise overwhelming. He raised his hand, and to his surprise, the room quieted. "I'm not a CEO. I'm not a politician," he began, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. "I'm a father, a janitor. And yes, I was once a young man with a future in diplomacy. But life doesn't always go the way you plan." The room stilled, cameras capturing every word. "I left Japan not because I didn't care, but because my family needed me. I buried my career to protect them. I've mopped floors to pay for my daughter's medicine. I've stayed invisible because survival mattered more than pride." He paused, unfolding Lily's drawing and holding it up. The crayon figures, crooked but bright, filled the screens of every camera. "This," he said, voice cracking slightly, "is the only legacy I care about. Being the hero my daughter believes I am. Giving her a life better than the one I had." The silence was electric. Then, slowly, applause broke out, not from reporters, but from the Japanese investors standing near the back. Their hands clapped. Firmly, their respect unmistakable. Others joined. Even executives who had doubted him nodded. The board chair stepped forward. "Mr. Daniel, the company would be honored if you'd accept a formal role, cultural liaison, effective immediately, not as a janitor, but as someone we trust to represent us." Daniel blinked, stunned. For the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. He was being seen. Meanwhile, Richard's angry shouts echoed as security dragged him out of sight, cameras capturing every second of his disgrace. Daniel lowered the drawing, folding it gently and slipping it back into his pocket. His voice was quiet now, but firm. "I'll do it for her." The reporters erupted again, but Daniel didn't feel overwhelmed anymore. For the first time, he stood tall. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Daniel stepped out with Lily's small hand tucked into his. She looked up, her eyes wide, trying to take in the polished floor, the rows of glass offices, the view of the city stretching far below. "Daddy, is this really yours?" she whispered. Daniel smiled, a little nervous, a little proud. "Ours." They stopped at a modest corner office, not the largest, not the flashiest, but dignified. His name printed neatly on the frosted. "Glass Daniel Ruiz, Cultural Liaison." He pushed the door open and Lily rushed inside, giggling. The space was simple. A desk, a few chairs, and a wide window overlooking the skyline. For Daniel, it might as well have been a palace. Lily climbed into the desk chair, spinning once before stopping to open her backpack. She pulled out a folded sheet of paper, smoothed it carefully, and taped it to the wall above his desk. It was her drawing. The stick figures, the crooked sun, the purple words, "You are my hero." "There," she said proudly. "Now everyone who comes in will know." Daniel's throat tightened. He ran a hand over the paper, as if the waxy crayon strokes were made of gold. For years he had whispered promises in the dark. Today, for the first time, he felt like he had kept one. He lowered himself into the chair across from her, glancing at the stack of files already waiting for him. The work would be hard, the scrutiny would be constant, but this time he wouldn't face it as a man hiding in shadows. Behind him, the window reflected the city, skyscrapers gleaming under the afternoon sun, alive with possibility. Lily leaned, back swinging her legs. "Do you still have to mop floors?" she asked. Daniel chuckled. "No, not anymore." "But you were good at it," she teased. He laughed. the sound easing something heavy inside him. Maybe, but I think I can be good at this too. They sat together in the quiet, father and daughter, surrounded not by luxury, but by dignity. For Daniel, that was enough. In the hallway, footsteps approached, executives passing by, glancing in with curious respect. No one brushed past him anymore. No one looked through him. He was no longer invisible. Lily pressed her face against the window, pointing. "Look, Daddy, we can see everything from here." Daniel joined her, standing tall, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Together, their silhouettes stretched against the glass, framed by the endless skyline. He thought of the years of silence, the sacrifices, the nights spent wondering if survival was all he could give her. And then he thought of the moment in the boardroom, the cameras, the drawing taped to his desk now. For the first time in a long time, he believed it. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was finally seen. The city pulsed below them, unaware that a janitor had just rewritten his story. And for Daniel and Lily, it was only the beginning.